Hello, good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome to the CABE 2020 virtual community and another webinar in our series of special speakers made available to our CABE virtual community. I'm Jan Correa, CEO of CABE, and while we really wish we could have been together this year at CABE 2020 in San Francisco, and we wish we could be together in person today, it is good to be together with you virtually. I hope you are in a safe place, managing the continuing circumstances of COVID-19, and ready to join together today with your CABE Familia, and over the next weeks as we continue to connect via our online and virtual community. So to get us started, it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome a wonderful colleague, our CABE Manager of Information Technology and Creative Design, Norma Rocha. Norma?
Hello and welcome. We are so glad to have you with us. Today's webinar is being presented by an impactful researcher and practitioner in the field of multicultural education, Enid, who is a longtime friend and recent keynote and featured speaker at CABE 2020 and past conferences. We are so very honored that she is able to join us today virtually. As we get ready for today's exciting session, I have a few housekeeping matters to share. As this is a webinar, the speaker's microphone will be active and the participants' microphones will be muted. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat icon on the Zoom control menu at the bottom of your screen. Just click it and the chat window will pop up so you can type in your comments and questions. For better focus, we will not be using the Q&A icon or the Q&A window. After the webinar, we will post the recorded version on the CABE 2020 virtual community website, so you can replay, post, and share with others, no password needed. So sit back, relax, and get ready for 45 minutes of powerful online engagement and learning. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome our Director of Programs and Events, Delma Sholinsky, who will be introducing our speaker today. Delma?
Thank you, Norma. It is my pleasure to introduce to Enid Lee, who is an anti-racist professional development specialist, leadership coach, and writer. She consults internationally on equitable education with emphasis on language, race, and culture, and their roles in education. Her consulting connection with the state of California began almost 25 years ago. Enid has publication which includes Letters to Marsha, A Teacher's Guide to Anti-Racist Education, Making Equity Explicit, a model for new teachers, Checking and Changing by System for Equity, and many, many more I can share with you. But I don't want to take up a lot of time. So at this time, I would like to introduce our friend Enid, who will be presenting today on multiculturalism and multilingualism. Equity is the key, especially in distant teaching and learning. I invite you to relax and enjoy this powerful engagement and learning as you enjoy the interesting and enlightenment presentation presented by Enid Lee. Welcome, Enid.
It is wonderful to be here. I am delighted that I'm able to join the CABE family this afternoon. Like Jan, I would have liked to have been in San Francisco, seen all of my friends there and meeting new ones, but it is good that we are together for this time. I'm looking forward to exchange of ideas after I've had a chance to present these thoughts. I particularly want to welcome all those people here who usually come to CABE events, and the new ones who perhaps would just like to think about teaching and learning and the implications for multiculturalism, multilingualism, and equity. So perhaps there are some new individuals here who are just going to do that. And with that group, I want to particularly welcome you if you're a new part of the group. When I had planned my session for April, my thought was to talk about multiculturalism and multilingualism. Equity is the key. But with all that has been happening with distance teaching and learning, it seemed very easy to simply make the connection between equity and distance teaching and learning. And that's because equity is an applied field. It is something that we can apply to every aspect of our lives, every aspect of education. So today you're going to be hearing about some of the tools that I've used when we're doing equity in classrooms that you recognize, and also how those have been applied by teachers and students and so forth in the distance learning setting. So here we go. Okay, I just thought I would begin with a quote from a student many years ago, a Canadian student, a white student actually, who said, multiculturalism can work as soon as racism is abolished. And I thought that was a very insightful statement by that young student, considering that at times multiculturalism is seen as a very soft topic and not one that forces us to look at structural issues. And I thought one thing that would help us in this conversation is to offer the definition of multicultural society that I worked on with two colleagues of mine some years ago in the book Beyond Heroes and Holidays. I was co-editor of that book. And here is what we had to say about multicultural society. And I think it will help you to see how equity is relevant here. We wrote, in a genuinely multicultural society, everyone would recognize and honor differences in race, ethnicity, gender, culture, class, language, sexual orientation, religion, abilities, and so on, while also acknowledging the similarities of experiences and interests across those social categories. And it is this paragraph, the second paragraph, that I think that puts multiculturalism in a different context than what we typically hear about. We also believe that multicultural society would be a just society. People controlling societal institutions would do everything in their power to provide to all people the sources for meaningful livelihoods, ensure true physical and emotional safety and security, and create an ecologically sustainable environment for the survival of future generations. If you have a moment after this, please go and look at Beyond Heroes and Holidays for that definition, because that puts multiculturalism in a clearly political context and includes the concept of multilingualism, which has to do with all languages and their users being embraced, recognized with equality, and the languages they speak, regardless of who the speakers are, with equal status. So that definition that was written, I think we did it 20 years ago. That book came out 20 years ago, even though we have updated it. It tells you what that youngster was thinking about when he said multiculturalism can work as soon as racism is abolished, because he recognized from the work we had done with him and his peers at schools that true multiculturalism, which has to do with power and recognition and voice and equality, could not happen unless we addressed racism. And to get at what we need to be talking about today, I just want to give you a quick working definition of racism, since the word can mean anything to anyone, it seems. And basically what I want to do is simply remind you that it has to do with the institutional power that is used to deny or grant people rights, responsibility, recognition, rights, resources, and respect based on their racial differences in terms of skin color and so forth, and also in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, in terms of nationhood. So we are talking here about the way in which institutions can, through the people who work in them, that's you, me, all the teachers, all the counselors, everyone, how we can deny people those rights. And if we don't address that denial in the way we do our work, multiculturalism cannot flourish. And Ibram Kendi's work on how to be an anti-racist, he reminds us that racial inequality has to do with two or more racial groups who are not standing on approximately equal footing. So equal footing would be parents from different backgrounds are assured that the communications that are coming to the school from them about the distance learning, about any matters regarding their children's education, their progress, and so forth, that it would be in a language with which they're comfortable. It would be done in a way that says we are doing this as a right and not a favor. And so it is that we need to think about those matters as we do teaching, as we look at distance teaching and learning. So just getting the definitions in place here, racism is not an episode, it's a system. And it has to do with all the ways in which we work with students. And what I'm going to ask you to do as we think about this work today is to look at the parts of the system that you're in and where you are supporting that system unconsciously in denying rights, respect, resources, and any of the things in terms of the different language speakers, English language learners, people in dual language programs, students who are coming from backgrounds that are not the ones that you've been used to. So this is a systemic approach we are taking. And if we take it, we have a chance of realizing the CABE vision of multiculturalism and multilingualism for all. So here we go. Because I believe that we can use every situation to learn from, I've been playing with the idea that COVID-19 has exposed the pre-existing conditions of inequality, racial inequality, linguistic inequality, class inequality. And in fact, this is a chance for us to learn how we might look at what that inequality does, particularly around race, to prevent us from serving students well. And I want you to take a moment and think about any experiences you have had in the past few weeks with distance teaching and learning, where inequality has had an impact on distance teaching and learning, particularly with respect to English language learners, to students who are in dual language programs, and so forth. So take a moment and think about and write in your chat box what you have seen around inequality and its impact on language learners of various kinds in various learning settings in this time of teaching and learning at a distance.
So Enid, this is Jan.
Yes,
and I'll come in and I'll share some of the comments that are popping up right now.
Yes.
I want to remind folks to go into the chat box and share what you're seeing in the sense of inequities during this time of COVID-19. So Enid, we're seeing that it's Eurocentric, lack of access to internet, parents have no internet and devices to do homework, fluency in English, maybe an emphasis on English and helping students that are English learners. Mainstream teachers are unwilling to co-plan to provide language objectives for home language learning. Teachers who, boy, there's lots of comments coming in.
Good.
Maybe I'll give you one or two more. Parents have no access to devices and Wi-Fi, committee on that. Online resources are in English only. And one more I will share is that some students have parents that don't have literacy skills in English or potentially in their own languages, and a lot of issues around access to technology and the internet.
Yes, thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to all those of you who have given those examples, because those are the examples that I've come across, and I want to spend some time very quickly to highlight some tools that have been used to help us interrupt the racism. Because just very quickly, for instance, examples that have to do with English being the only language that the planning is done in, or parents being communicated with, or resources. All of those come out of the pre-existing condition of racial inequality and connection with class, of course. And the fact that some lives, some languages matter more than others. And I just want to say that when we think about this work on equity, remember that you cannot get to equity without naming inequities. That's the very first thing. Whether it's distance or at home or close to you, we must name the inequities. We must name who is being disadvantaged by our practices, historically. So for example, and I'll be very quick with this because I want to make sure that we get to the tools, but history is important. So for example, the knowledge that history has shaped a great deal of what has happened in this country in terms of language. Just to give you a quote, where in 1864, Congress makes it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their native language. Native children as young as 4 years old are taken from their parents and sent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs off-reservation boarding schools, whose goal, as one BIA official put it, was to kill the Indian and save the man. The only reason why I'm evoking that particular example is that what we see now in terms of what happens with learners dates back to that institutional practice of prioritizing and making supreme English and what is accustomed to their culture. And we've got to keep that in our heads when we're doing anti-racist equity work for multiculturalism and multilingualism. History matters. Also to note that all areas of life in school, content, whatever, those things are focused on, equity is a part of all of those matters. Today, we are going to focus on school and family arrangements, content of curriculum, and assessment. And if I had more time with you, we will address what all of them look like, but we don't. And I want the concept of systems to be before you. All of the arrangements, all of the procedures that form and work together, like how the Chromebooks are given out, who gets opportunity to be practiced with the Chromebooks in a respectful way, who is met with at a certain time based on their own working hours, and so on and so forth. What time teachers are allowed. So systems matter. Now, let me go to another one that makes a big difference, and it has to do with the idea of the gaps. Think about gaps, and we often talk about there's a gap in the performance of the English learners or other groups of students. And I want us to change our thinking on that. The gap is not in the student, the gap is in the system, the way we do things. And if we address that gap, then we could have the goal of equality. So as we think about students who are perhaps not turning on their Chromebooks and not getting online, or parents who are not responding, or whatever, rethink it and say the gap is not there, the resistance is not there, it is in the way we are addressing it. And I know this can be a tall order, but it's important that we change our thinking and focus on what the limitations of our practice are. And that gets me to these cards that have been used by teachers all across the country, and English EL teachers, dual language teachers. This is 54 cards that I've collected over the course of 15 years, drawn from experiences, Alaska, all over the place, dual language classrooms, and so forth. And they focus on 3 systems: preparation, teaching, and reflection. And I argue very clearly that we have to prepare for equity. We cannot just leap in front of a classroom and expect that it's going to go smoothly, because inequities are built into our practice, inequities that are hidden, and so we have to think about how we might change them. All right, so here's a quick example. This card talks about knowing your students' experiences and prior knowledge that and home language that will allow you to deal with working with them at a distance. Teachers tell me that the students and the families with which they have made connection and whom they have grown to know during the time where we're in regular classrooms, those are the families they can reach. And those teachers are also aware that some of the experiences that students have gone through with their families in terms of immigration, in terms of documentation, in terms of, for instance, being a member of a group where you see a person like yourself being killed and I can't do this presentation without making mention of what happened in Minnesota with the African-American man where a knee of a policeman was put into his neck and he said, "I can't breathe." When I'm talking about knowing our students' experiences, I'm talking about those hard, ravaging, destructive features of racism and so forth that our kids live with. I'm not talking about only the pretty pieces. So teachers who have been open to that and have worked with it have found that in distance learning, they can connect. That they find that parents are willing to talk with them about what is really going on. A teacher said to me, a family said, this hybrid system that our district is going to use is not going to work, and I'm just going to leave town and we're going to move to North Carolina because at least we'll have somebody there to help with the children. So truthful communication with families will happen when we take into account their real experiences. Also, this question of connecting lessons to students' experience. Can you think of the many ways in which we can use what is happening with COVID-19 and deaths and loss of jobs and who is unprotected and link it with what we think we are talking with students about, and doing it in all of the languages? This is another one. How do we want our students to feel about the people they're learning about? And often we separate academic learning to its social emotional learning. And I've tried to encourage teachers to not do this, to link them. The social emotional learning is rich with academic possibility. It's rich with linguistic potential to learn how to think about, how to feel about, and how to see yourself. You know, when you think of even the word essential, what does that mean in the languages that the students come from? And how can we make sure that those people we say are essential in terms of who is working and who is not, and who is able to work from home and who is not? How can we truly help that to be part of what students are learning about in these difficult times? I have another slide here, which is drawn from the reflection section. And it says, when I reflect on what I've learned from talking with students, family members, I can fine-tune my systems for greater equity. So I'm including families as part of as members who we should survey as we do this work. Families having the ability to say to us and the freedom to say to us, you're calling the house too often, or you're not calling enough, or you're calling at a wrong time, and for you not to take it as any attack. But that differentiation with family engagement is what we need to think about. We think about differentiation with instruction and so forth, and what is applied to family arrangements also. Let me move to another one, the area of content and purpose. A lot of the material I've looked at about distance learning speaks quite accurately about the denial of the technology, the absence of the Chromebooks and so forth. I don't see enough reference to the what, to what it is the Chromebooks should allow us to do. And so this slide was used by a teacher in a Spanish literacy program. She said, I have asked myself, what historical information can I embed in this work I'm doing to help students understand what we are going through? And she talks about a podcast that she developed with the students on the on pandemics from history. And she relied on, and I recommend it to her, Frank Snowden's book, Epidemics and Society, in which he traces these epidemics, and he goes to things like the yellow fever that the First Nations people, Native people have gone through. And so she is thinking not only about how do I get the particular grammatical points done, I'm thinking about the what. What is education for? What are we learning about? How can I tie this to common core expectations and help students realize that there's a lot to learn in what we are going through, and we can do it from a distance, and we can invite parents and family members to be part of the conversation. What have you gone through as a family? What have we gone through as a community? What has a grandparent known about hard times like these, the depression and so forth? So that's one of the ways you interrupt racist thinking, because one of the pillars of racist thinking is inaccurate information, sometimes deliberately inaccurate information about historical conditions and practices. So that's one that helps to interrupt. And I threw this one in. What specific vocabulary, grammatical structures, and contextual features do I need to teach in order to ensure that English language learners, speakers of African American language, and students with special education placements are able to engage in the task? Because as we do our work as language teachers, we need to remember there's a range of experiences and capacities and conditions in our meetings. So as we reach out to families, we think about what the implications are for students with attention disorder and so forth. So language teachers and multilingualism needs to take into account all of those kinds of factors. And so that's one that people consider. I included that one having to do with what opportunities for students and families to access their language of comfort, so that you don't feel disadvantaged because the language in which you're being spoken with and to doesn't reflect yours. I think quickly of a youngster who gave me an example where his teacher, having gone through one of my sessions, had gone back and did something that showed how equity makes a difference. The student said, you know, oh, I know, these students were in 4th grade, and I had said to the teacher, when you come back to the last session, I want you to bring an example of what the children think this equity workshop was about based on what you did. And that's something, a good thing to do yourself, to have kids say. And this child said, he wrote me a letter saying, "Dear Miss Equity," because apparently he thought that that was my official title. So he said, "Dear Miss Equity, I thank you for looking into this for us, but here's what our teacher did. He allowed us to conduct the parent-student conference in home language. And when my dad, who was Punjabi speaking, heard his language being spoken in the school, he cried with happiness because he felt as if the school was his." And what I'm trying to get at here is that in all of these ways, we can disrupt the Eurocentricity, the heavy dominance on English as the only way of acceptable conversation through acts like these. And I threw this one in because I used to do work a lot in a school where we had students from migrant families. And so they would come at different times depending on when their families moved. And so in systems, we have to ask ourselves, and this is a good thing to ask now as we look at return to school, how are we going to make the entry possible for different groups of students depending on what conditions are at home in terms of jobs, in terms of having to travel, in terms of just not being able to come at the set time. Today, I had a letter from one of my teachers, and she said, I couldn't get in touch with you before because 5 of the students in my Spanish literacy class, they contacted me and said they had deaths from COVID in their family. And I have to think about what that means in terms of curriculum and how I engage them. So I'm saying, let us be flexible and make differentiation in terms of our systems, in terms of systems of class, in terms of our school, in terms of the district, and in fact, in terms of the nation, in terms of what we change and who we change it for, because people are entering at different points. And if we truly value every life, every person, every possibility, we will do that differentiation. And the last one has to do with being inclusive and positive in language as we talk about students, avoiding the deficit and emphasizing the richness of the diversity, race, class, family structure, sexual orientation, and so forth. Those are just small tools that teachers have used from the Equity Pack. And if you're interested in finding out more of them, you will find work for them on the website, on my website. So those are some of the tools. And this one has to do assessment. How do we show that what students are learning from these tasks? And oftentimes teachers have said to me, they're not learning anything because I'm not teaching them. And I said, no, students are learning regardless of whether we're teaching them or not, because they're learning from observation, from experience, and they're learning from families and communities and from the statements that are made publicly about their worth or the lack of it in this community. And a piece of what we have to do with assessment as students go back to school is document to the best of our knowledge what our children have learned in the time that they have been distant from us, and weave those things into curriculum. We also have to be clear with the communication in many languages as to how students have progressed and how we are going to get them back on track for graduation. Those are assessment questions that have to do with equity. And we need to communicate them in a way that parents of all classes, linguistic backgrounds understand, because that is their right and it is our responsibility to do so. I want to end with this whole question of history being written by the winners. That statement was made by a prominent figure in the government last week. And he was not talking about what I'm talking about, but I am using it so we can talk about it for ourselves. We can claim the writing of history by those of us who are determined to win the battle for justice, humanity, equality, multiculturalism. And that's why I want you to write in the chat boxes. That's why I want you to document what you have done with families, what your colleagues, with the students, get the students to write, because that history is often not recalled. What the history that's written is the official version. And this is our version as those who remember these particular words for what I call the equity word wall. The three words are all, yet, and. And let me just say very quickly where the all needs to be remembered from. This is from the US Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we know that even as that statement was being written in the Constitution, there was not a commitment to all. Some of us were there were many excluded in terms of their humanness. And what I want us to do as we do our work is to include all in our work, to keep asking as we talk around tables and so forth. And you can ask it in every language because I'm sure it's there. You can ask who is not included. When we say all children, which children are we not thinking about in terms of class, in terms of language and so forth? And I also want us not to have to choose between life and livelihood. I want it to be and, not or. I want it to be all the students, regardless of the backgrounds from which they come and their potential to be multilingual. It is not just one, it's and, not or. And the final word, yet. We want to attach the word yet to everything, because we will not give up until the work is finished. And like that student who said to me, multiculturalism can work as soon as racism is abolished. I want us to remember that we are the modern day abolitionists in terms of racial injustice. We often think of abolitionists as people who are old, dead, white, just gone, dealing only with enslavement. But there is much that we have to abolish in order that we can all experience human freedom, dignity, and the right to express ourselves, our cultures in a variety of languages, and to use that language to critically analyze the text of the society in which we live, and to use that language to rewrite the text and inform others beside us, those who will come after us, about what it means to be multilingual and why multilingualism matters and what we can do with a range of languages. So I want to welcome all of the modern day abolitionists who are here for us to talk about how it is that we can do this work, even with those small cards, as the many teachers have done. And I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share these ideas with you. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your questions, your challenges, your contradictions. Those of you who know me well, that Enid likes a good argument. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Enid. Such an inspiration. And I will quote Arsena Tovar. She says, "This has been so inspiring for me." And we're getting many comments such as that. wanting to share this presentation with colleagues. And we want to remind everybody that this presentation will be made available tomorrow on the CABE 2020.org website. You'll be able to find the archive of this and be able to share it with others as well. Enid, I'm going to ask your permission to do something. As you are inspiring folks, we know we have many, educators on the line right now. And would it be okay with you if we asked them in the chat box to share with us what is one thing, at least one thing they have done so far to disrupt equity? And so those of you that are listening, if you would share that, something you've done during this time of distance and hybrid learning, anything that you would like to share of how you have been disrupting equity or addressing equity, please share that in the chat box so we can share that back and have record of that. I love that idea of having record of that. And as folks are doing that, and please add them onto the chat box, what are you doing to address equity in your distance learning? There were several questions, Enid.
Yes.
One really had to do kind of with the real practicality, because I think the cards really are resource people were really looking at and thinking how they might use them. So one question was, how would you use those cards in professional learning or working with English learners? And then added on to that, are the cards a tool that could be used with teachers or administrators? Are they providing examples of practices? How would you suggest that the cards be used by educators? And the other question would be, can you just go to your website and get them? Are they available when you go to the website?
Yes. Okay. So answer the first question, that last question. Yes, they are available at my website. You can find out how to get to buy them if you like. And the question of how to use them, I'm so happy to report that they can be used in a whole variety of ways. Even though in the first section of the cards, I suggest how to use them. Thankfully, people just ignore me and use them in whatever way they want to. For example, using with students, the cards on reflection, which are the blue ones, teachers have reported that they have used those cards with the students. So when they think of a practice that they want to implement, like for instance, the teacher who had the children do the parent-student conversation in the home language, what the teacher did was find out how how well he was doing with equity. So in other words, teachers engage in the practices in terms of including history and so forth, and then they check with students, what are you learning? How is this different? So that's one use. I'm thinking also of how the teacher who did the pandemic, podcast pandemic. She is a Spanish teacher. And so she took the idea of historical background and she just worked with the students in it, and they found out where people in different Spanish speaking countries, what they were doing, what they had done. So she applied it to her content piece, and she got students to look at that. And then parents can be engaged in this conversation too, when you ask, what is it that you are learning from home? What is it you are learning from family? What is it you're learning from community? A professional development session that I did with a whole staff. We had the vast majority of people who were support teachers, who were like paraprofessionals who were supporting teachers. They were part of the whole conversation, and they were the multilingual people. And when we talked about what we did, I gave an assignment that says, describe what comes to your mind when you think of the word equity. And in order to demonstrate the value of multilingualism, I put my finger on the scale at that very moment in receiving information. And I said, and please describe it in any language in addition to English, if you have that available. And I tell you, the room just burst into Farsi, into Tagalog, into Spanish, into Hindi, and so on and so forth. And what it did, it changed the perception of the monolingual staff about the support folk, who were after school people, who were the secretaries and so forth. And I tell you, it turned the community around. So yes, the cards have multiple uses. And there will soon be a book that documents those uses. Yeah.
That's fabulous. So,
Yeah.
another comment that's come up that kind of relates to that, like, I think the example you've just given right now talks about how you really are interrupting that racist speaking and structures and avoiding the deficit.
Yes.
But a comment was, we are still receiving, we still hear colleagues use that deficit language. They
Yes.
are using racist expressions and
Yes.
this, whether it's actual words they're saying or body language, what have you.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions to help colleagues with that about how to really interrupt that racist talk and the deficit perception?
Yes, very quick answers and first of all, it is important that we expect racism, but we do not accept it. I have a poster that says that, and the expectation allows us to be ready. And the reason why we expect it, because it's systemic, it's structural, it's historical, it's deep. And so, for instance, when a racist remark is made about, because it's deficit language about students and their willingness and ability to do the work. A question, what I call the use of the pointed question. What leads you to think that? Just seek information, right? So what makes you think that that person is just lazy or their family doesn't value education? What makes you think that? That's one. Another one is what I call embracing the language that the person uses. And so they say they are, they're just not interested in education. And I would capture the interested piece and say, well, what do you think they're interested in? So they realize they've been heard and we are changing it around. And then the third piece is simply providing a different narrative and say, this has been my experience with thus and such, and once you get them on that, get them over to that side, then you can begin the work of the historical context and the political context. A teacher who used those cards said to me that because of equity, he had a student who wasn't doing the work. And he kept thinking, well, why is he not doing it? But because it says that the gap is in the system and not in the student, he kept moving the student until because he didn't give up. He didn't think the deficit was with him. He said, there is something about what is happening here that is not helping the student. And he moved him around. And one day he sat him down at the very front. And the student looked up at the board and said, my, this is like 3D. The kid had not had his glasses for a whole semester and was the first time he was actually seeing what was on the board. And the teacher said, I wish I had known. However, I didn't give up because I'm committed to the idea with equity that what we do, we look at the system and we find out what will bring out the potential in the student as opposed to determining that they are just lacking, that it's just a deficit, that they're just stereotypically unable and so forth. So those are things.
That's great. And I think our final question, and it's going to references back to your referencing current events and, just the horrendous things that we've seen now out of Minneapolis, out of New York, other parts of the country. And we so appreciate that today that you brought up the fact that they have to come into conversation, whether we're with our students in person or via distance learning. Do you have any suggestions, one or two framing questions or ways that teachers could bring that into their teaching, into their experiences, if they're able to be online with their students, how to bring that out to really draw out the conversation with students? Do you have a couple of framing questions or ideas to share with our colleagues today? Because it's such an unbelievable time, and we are really reeling with this. How would we approach that as teachers?
Yes, one of the things that I think is important, and even if the children are very young, we start with what we think they might have heard. And sometimes as teachers, we protect students because we think from the places where we live and where we sit that they are shielded from that kind of behavior and that kind of terror, because that's the only word I can use to describe what is going on. And sometimes we're wrong. So I would say, like, we may be talking about the news. We may be talking about what happened lately. So a question might be within the context of what happened, what have you heard about lately, that you're wondering about, that you're thinking about. And if you do this on a regular basis, it doesn't get so hard when we're doing it in distance teaching and learning, like what's new? What have you heard about, right? And if they don't bring anything up, you can say, I heard about such and such. And here is how I feel about it. That's the first part. And then that's the first thing. So you bring yourself into it and your emotion. And then I make a connection between injustice in the society at large and injustice in our classrooms, of how people are treated or how we treat each other. What would it be like if you asked for help? What would it be like if, as we gathered here, I decided that you could not be trusted? I would not even give you a chance to explain what happened before I threw you out and you began to make your way to, you know, to the jail, to the, you know. So I would link it, one, to what might be an interest, two, to what I would bring information into what they have heard, what I have heard, and I would link it to classrooms. So what would this be like? How would it be compared to? And the fourth piece is always help students to look at what is done by committed, caring abolitionists like ourselves. Things get changed when human beings join together and speak up and speak out. And one of the ways that we are using our multilingualism is to speak up and speak out and disrupt the order. Like, what would you say if such and such? Those are ways I would do it, and keep it well within the curriculum. There is very little that I can think about that doesn't fit into curriculum expectations once we deeply understand what those expectations are. I remember saying to somebody about Common Core, and you know, there are concerns about Common Core and the way it's assessed, but those things are called common because they belong to all of us. That's why they're common, because they're things that we commonly do. Explicate, use math to assess inequality, use science to assess the truth of a statement on television, and so on and so forth. So I would keep it grounded in our reality as teachers and learners from each other. And I would also say that that would ignite interest in ways that you've never seen before. You know, a lot of times relevance, rigor, richness, those are things that get left off the conversation because we are thinking about the Chromebooks, which we must think about. But I want us to remember what for and what is this about.
Wow, thank you so much, Enid. We could talk forever. And I invite our colleagues to look at the examples. There are many wonderful examples of what you've been doing to really interrupt racism and really bring forth equity in your teaching. Enid, as we bring this to a close today, I just want to thank you for making the connections for us today, to helping us remind us how equity becomes the center of all we're doing, whether we're in person with our students in school communities or through distance learning, and reminding us of the key role that we play as educators in interrupting and disrupting and responding to racism and inequity in our system. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to maybe give you another final word, and then we'll ask Norma to close our session today. Anything else you'd like to share, Enid?
Just to say that this book, Beyond Heroes and Holidays, it has the definitions, it has the story about the young man who said multiculturalism can be abolished as soon. Multiculturalism can work as soon as racism is abolished. And the article is an article about it here, the definitions. I also just want to show this. This book is called Letters to Marsha, A Teacher's Guide to Anti-Racist Education. I wrote this book 35 years ago. I was very wet behind the ears. Actually, I was exactly the same age as this book is now. And on Monday, I shared this book. I was working in Canada. I shared this book with a teacher, a dual language teacher. And she said several times she had to turn it to the front to see the year it was written, because what it dealt with was so much of what's still happening. And I said, first of all, I'm glad to know that I'm not irrelevant and thrown aside yet. But what I want us to know is that this work is ongoing. Over the next 35 years, there's going to be more to do. And I want all of us to be writing about how we're changing that. You know, I have to say, when I wrote this book, I thought, oh, by age 40, we'd have this covered. Of course not. I was in Canada. So anyway, just to say that book is listed. It's being republished 35 years later because I didn't think anybody would want it, but they're asking for it, so it'll be updated. And then there are the cards, which were the cards that we drew from. Those are very current. I didn't write those 35 years ago. That's much more recent. And I keep changing them depending on it. And I want us to document. I want us to have the courage to ask the hard questions as we do this distance teaching and learning. And it reminds me, just my very last piece, of the words of African-American poet who says, her name is Sonia Renee Taylor. And some of you may have seen her quote about we're not going back to the old normal. And she says, we have been given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. And I would like to say, let's take this opportunity to stitch that new garment wherever we're working, with whoever we're working with the students, whatever the conditions are, and to bring it to all the policy tables, all the decision-making boards, all the people who are exercising power in institutions that either deny us life and liberty or grant us and ensure that all of us have it equally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enid, for that motivating and inspirational presentation. This presentation is a valuable resource for biliteracy instruction and a powerful addition to our CABE 2020 virtual community webinar series. Today's webinar can be accessed by everyone on the CABE 2020 virtual community website at www.cabe2020.org. Keep checking the CABE website for more exciting webinars. On Monday, June 1st at 2 p.m., we will be holding a teacher strategy webinar with Dr. Ivania Soto, which you can sign up for at a different location on the CABE webpage. Just go to www.gocabe.org and click on Teacher Strategy Webinars. Again, that is www.gocabe.org. And on Thursday at 3 p.m., CABE will hold a Facebook Live session with Ima Marañón Davis in Spanish on social emotional support and maintaining balance in times of uncertainty for our parents, educators, and community. Go to the CABE Facebook page for more information and to watch live. Again, a big thank you to Enid Lee, and most importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us today here in the CABE 2020 virtual community. On behalf of the CABE Board of Directors and the entire CABE team, we genuinely hope you have felt that CABE connection, inspiration, and love, just as if we were gathered in San Francisco at the CABE 2020 conference. Please stay safe, be well, and remember that together we are CABE strong. See you next time.